Hello, ladies, and anyone else who cares to listen. I'm going to talk about the progressive movement a bit more today. And in class, we already talked about kind of the first two goals of the movement, protecting social welfare, promoting moral improvement. We talked about some of the progressive reformers who worked towards those ends. And in this lecture, I'll be talking about economic reform and political reform and the people involved in the progressive movement who worked toward those particular goals. Much of the political reform is going to center on a couple of different aspects. First, ending the influence of political machines, which is something we talked about during the Gilded Age. And we know that political machines controlled city governments, often state governments. It was a system of party bosses that accepted bribes in return for favors and also gave favors in return for votes. And of course, the most famous we talked about was Tammany Hall in New York City, with its most famous boss, Boss Tweed, and the cartoon on the right, of course, shows the Tammany Tiger, which represents that political machine of Tammany Hall and the power it had over New York City. There's the tiger completely sitting over and controlling and dominating the island of Manhattan. Another aspect to this political reform was giving people more input and power in the political process. So we're going to see ways that occurred during the Gilded Age, things that we have in place today that have their roots in this period of time in the progressive era. So a quintessential progressive politician would be considered Robert La Follette. La Follette was a Republican. He had served in Congress, and in 1900 he was elected as governor of Wisconsin. And as governor, he made it his goal to institute several progressive type of reforms. He also came up with what's called the Wisconsin idea, that scholars and people involved in the academic world and political science should come up with ideas to enhance democracy, kind of making Wisconsin this kind of like incubator of, this enhanced progressive style democracy. And so he utilized these ideas that they came up with in various ways. One thing he's known for is tax reform. He taxed railroad property at the same rates as other business property. This was a new and unique idea at the time. The railroads oftentimes had monopolies. They had been getting away with a lot of kind of unfair business practices, and so La Follette wanted to change that. Also, business reform, regulating rates, forbidding railroads to issue free passes to state officials and people that could possibly influence legislation that protected the railroads. He saw that as, kind of a corrupt practice. Also, civil service reform. This is to institute a system where workers get jobs based on merit, like taking a civil service exam. So it's more based on what you know than who you know. And then finally, workplace reform. Instituting a workers' compensation program for injuries. That meant if you got injured in the factory or your workplace and it was generally considered the fault of the employer, you would receive money for that, for your injuries that you received there, as well as instituting factory inspections so that the factories can be inspected to make sure that there were good working conditions that wouldn't lead to people getting injured in the workplace. Now we're going to look at state reforms, progressive reforms that took place at the state level. First, we have the secret ballot. It's also known as the Australian ballot because that's where it was first utilized. And this ensured privacy at the ballot box so that citizens could cast their votes without party bosses knowing how they voted. So if you owed a party boss a favor, at least they thought you did, you could vote how you wanted based on your conscience, not based on any favors that you knew. Another reform was the initiative. That allowed a bill to originate with the people instead of their legislature. So if the people had an idea for a bill, they could originate that bill without having to play the game of politics with the state legislature, having to propose the bill. The next was the referendum. That allows voters to decide if a bill should be passed. So instead of the state legislature voting on a particular bill, that bill is put up to the general public in the state, and they are allowed to vote whether that should be enacted or not. Another is recall. That means that voters can decide to remove an elected official from office before their term ends. Let's say the governor is doing a really, really bad job. In states that have this recall option, the voters can vote that person actually out of office before their term was actually supposed to end. And then we have direct primary. So this means that voters select the candidates to run for office instead of party bosses. And this is going to give people in the different parties, whether Republican or Democrat, much more say in who is going to run and represent their party, both at the state level and at the national level in politics. So all of these things were really designed to give the people more of a hand in politics, more direct influence in politics and remove some of the corruption and some of the political machinery that was going on in politics prior to the Gilded Age. And during the Gilded Age, I should say. Prior to the Progressive Era is what I mean to say. Now, two important reforms at the city level included city commissioners and city managers. So city commissioners were experts in different areas that were running specific departments in the city. So you still had a mayor, but then below the mayor, directly reporting to the mayor, you had these different commissioners. So you had a police commissioner. They were probably somebody who had worked their way up through the police department, and they had expert knowledge about how that department functioned, and they were able and capable to run it. Then you had a sanitation commissioner in charge of garbage collection. You had a parks commissioner in charge of park upkeep and maintenance, and so on in all these different areas. These people reported to the mayor. It was able to allow the mayor to delegate to different departments and different commissioners these different functions, and so that was to help create a more efficient city government. Another plan was city managers. So instead of a mayor, the city council, which is the group within the city that passes the laws, that represents the people in different parts of the city in different neighborhoods, they hire a city manager to run each city department and report to the city council about that. And it's considered more efficient than having a mayor, especially in a period of time when political machines were still so strong and there was still a lot of corruption going on. And the city managers were expected to kind of run the city more like a business, and businesses were considered to be running more efficiently than politics were at this time, and arguably still today that happens. Now we're going to take a look at the progressive presidents, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, and he becomes president in 1901, and of course you all know that's because McKinley was assassinated right here in Buffalo, of course, and so Roosevelt, as vice president, has to come in and be sworn in and take over the role of president, and then he will be reelected in 1904 on his own right. So Teddy Roosevelt's guiding principle when it came to foreign policy was definitely speak softly and carry a big stick, and we've talked about that, particularly in his approach to Latin America. When we talk about domestic policy, new nationalism and the square deal, and the term bully pulpit should be understood. So new nationalism means that the president should use the bully pulpit to guide the American public to support moral causes, a lot of those causes that the progressive reformers have been advocating that we've spoken about. So he felt that he should use that pulpit. A pulpit is like where a minister stands when they preach, basically. He should use that power in that position to create social and economic reforms and to be able to articulate to the American people why those reforms should be taking place. And not necessarily be a bully per se, but definitely be a guiding force, more so taking the presidency in a direction that it hasn't before necessarily, really influencing legislation more so than many previous presidents and really having an active role in that. He also believes in government action to supervise big business, and so he's going to be known as a trust buster, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing to associate with him is the square deal. Square means fair, so basically a fair deal for people. So he definitely approaches labor in a way that it hadn't been before. In 1902, there's a co-worker strike in Pennsylvania. Teddy Roosevelt threatens to send the army in to take over the mines if the owners of the mine don't agree to arbitration, don't agree to allow Roosevelt to kind of come between and mediate the conflict between labor and between the employers, between the mine owners. And so this is the first time that government doesn't side with business over labor, because we've seen it time and time again. We've seen presidents sending troops, and we've seen, a lot of court orders and injunctions against the use of the labor movement and the strike. So this is a really big shift in the way that labor in this country is approached, particularly by the president. So here are some ways that the government regulated labor during Teddy Roosevelt's administration. First is the Employers' Liability Act of 1906, and this means that mandatory accident insurance for railroad workers needs to be provided by the railroad companies. This is an important step because it's saying that employers need to take more responsibility for workers injured on the job. And working on railroads could be a very, very dangerous job, and there were a lot of injuries. And when somebody was injured, they had no recourse. They had no way that they could oftentimes provide for their families after this. And so this act said that that insurance needed to be provided for those railroad workers in case they were injured on the job and lost that livelihood. Now, when it comes to the Supreme Court, there are two cases you need to know. One is Lochner versus New York. there was a state law limiting workers' hours, and that was ruled unconstitutional. It was saying that such a law interfered with the contract between the employer and the employee. And this was a bit of a setback for labor in many ways. The other case you need to know is Mueller versus Oregon, which limited women to a 10-hour workday to protect their health. So this actually said that a state law, in this case in Oregon, was upheld. It was constitutional because it was protecting women. And it actually, in the ruling in the case, was quite sexist if you read it. It was protecting women because, women were considered weaker, less physically adept, and also if you interfered with their ability to reproduce and have children, obviously that was detrimental to the whole human race. So that was a lot of the basis behind this case. Yet it did uphold the state's right to create legislation regarding labor and labor contracts and such. Now, one of the biggest things Teddy Roosevelt is known for is trust busting. He wants to break up those trusts, those illegal combinations of businesses that we've talked about previously, monopolies basically. But when he did so, he definitely differentiated between good trusts and bad trusts. Okay. In 1902, he ordered the breakup of the Northern Securities Company. This was a company that owned and controlled interest in Northwestern railroads, and he said it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act going back to 1890. So this definitely showed that the president is willing now to enforce laws against big business, certainly to an extent that presidents weren't necessarily before. Two Supreme Court cases you need to know here are the Northern Securities Company versus the United States, 1904. That case ordered the Northern Securities Company to be dissolved. It was viewed as a bad trust, as well as the Swift Company. So it was Swift and Company versus United States. This was a beef trust. This was a monopoly essentially in the meat processing industry, and that was ordered dissolved as well. So we're definitely seeing steps now to take trusts and monopolies and to a greater extent really look at them, break them down, scrutinize them, and oftentimes say, okay, this is an illegal combination of businesses and needs to be stopped and ended. Here's a cartoon which is really a nod to what a big hunter and outdoorsman Teddy Roosevelt was. We know that he went on safaris and he hunted extensively, and this is kind of portraying that in his treatment of the trust. So again, he saw good trust, he saw bad trust. The bad trust is this bear hair that he has his foot on. He's killed that one, obviously. But then he has on a leash a good trust, right? So he's going to get rid of the bad trust, but he's going to work to restrain and control and regulate the good trust, to keep them in line so they don't essentially turn into bad trust. There's kind of a gray area between a good trust and a bad trust, and Teddy Roosevelt said, it's the government's role and the president's role and the court's role to really police that and to try to restrain those good trusts as much as possible. So the most important pieces of legislation under Roosevelt, or laws passed when Roosevelt was president, are going to include the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, which was influenced by Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle, and talking about the terrible conditions in the meatpacking industry and the meat processing industry. And Teddy Roosevelt supposedly couldn't eat his sausages the morning after he finished reading that book, and he definitely pushed for better regulations in the meatpacking industry and inspections of those facilities. The Pure Food and Drug Act was similar in nature. It protected customers. Drugs in particular were not well regulated at that time, so a lot of the medicines being sold made claims that were just unsubstantiated, and in fact sometimes they did more harm than good, so this was to protect the people from those types of things. We have the Elkins Act also, which increased the powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission. It outlawed rebates to preferred customers by the railroads, so this one was very much targeting railroads. Even though legislation had been passed before, it was very ineffective, it was not well regulated, and this was to make sure that these things were being carried out and enforced. The Hepburn Act in 1906, that strengthens the Interstate Commerce Commission even further to be able to regulate those rates. And I'll give you a handout that lists several of these acts in a little more detail. The Newlands Reclamation Act in 1901, that is dealing with Teddy Roosevelt's kind of number one concern, which was protecting the environment. It was encouraging conservation by allowing dams and irrigation systems to be built using money from selling public lands. essentially. So this is really the heart of what Teddy Roosevelt kind of loved, is the outdoors, and he wanted to protect kind of our natural places and environment, and this is one way to do that. He was very much influenced by two conservationists, Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, who founded Yellowstone, and these are two names you should know of people involved in the movement to found some of the national parks, and definitely influenced Teddy Roosevelt in his conservationist efforts and views. Now we have William Howard Taft. You see him pictured here, and he was a Republican like Teddy Roosevelt, and he was a bigger trust buster even than Teddy Roosevelt. And no, I don't mean because he was bigger literally. I mean he was more of an aggressive trust buster than Teddy Roosevelt. Anyway, during Taft's term of office, we have a very important Supreme Court case, the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus the United States. Good old Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company we're talking about here. And in this case, the Supreme Court ordered that it should be dissolved. It used something called the rule of reason to differentiate between reasonable and unreasonable combinations of businesses. Okay, so it kind of took that idea of good and bad trust to a new level, saying Standard Oil Company was indeed a bad trust, and meaning it needed to be dissolved to break up that what was essentially a monopoly. Then we also have the Mann-Elkins Act. That dealt with a trust in the communication industry. So this extended the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate communication in this case. We've already seen it utilized in regards to transportation, particularly the railroads. This is going to extend that to communication, telegraph, telephones, things like that. Also really important things that we need to talk about during Taft's administration are the 16th Amendment, and the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913. That created the progressive income tax. If you remember the progressive income tax, it's also called the graduated income tax, and that was something that those populists had advocated for, decades prior to this, meaning that the more income you make, the higher percentage of your income you will pay in income taxes, and this is to level out the playing field, essentially. The other amendment you need to know, which was passed the same year in 1913, is the 17th Amendment, which allowed for direct election of U.S. senators. If you remember, the only kind of national legislatures that the people themselves were directly electing were the members of the House of Representatives. Senators had been elected or appointed by state legislatures, essentially. So this gave the people, again, a more direct say and influence in the political process and who was representing them. So that's a really big deal. So during Taft's administration, there grew to be a split in the Republican Party over a couple of particular issues, and one was a tariff issue. Now, I know we've talked about tariffs a lot. I know that tariffs can be boring, and I'm sick of talking about tariffs too, but yet here I have to again. So Taft tried to lower what was known as the Payne-Aldrich tariff, but the Senate amended it to remove most of the reductions, and this caused a rift in the Republican Party. The other issue was the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. So Taft appointed this guy Ballinger as Secretary of the Interior, and Ballinger sold Alaskan land to mining and lumber companies. So this is essentially public land sold for a private profit, because those companies will be able to utilize that land to make money, to make a profit, and a lot of people think that's a pretty bad thing. So Taft fired Gifford Pinchot as head of the Forest Service because he had protested that sale, even though he was really kind of going with his conscience here, and he thought this whole, Ballinger was kind of shady, and therefore that, Taft's protection of him made him a little shady too. So it was an issue that again caused a rift in the Republican Party, and that's going to be an issue that leads us to the next election. Teddy Roosevelt, who had served 2 terms as president already, one after McKinley had died and one that he was elected to in his own right, was watching from the sidelines and was kind of disgusted with what he was seeing going on. So he decided that he was going to take advantage of the split in the Republican Party to run for president again in 1912. And he kind of led a group of progressive Republicans who had split from the party, and they were called the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party was its nickname. And this becomes another important third party in American history, and this one is particularly surrounded around one individual, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. Some third parties emerge over issues. Some third parties emerge around one individual, and this is one of those third parties in American history. It got its name because Teddy Roosevelt was shot at one point, and he went on that day to make a 90-minute speech without getting any medical attention, and, because he was a tough guy, and when he asked, he said, "I'm as strong as a bull moose, a strong, tough male moose." And you can see that quote here, "I'm as strong as a bull moose, and you can use me to the limit." Like, I am tough, I'm strong, I am unfazed, I'm going to continue, just because I got shot, no big deal. This is tough guy Teddy Roosevelt talking here. So in the election then, in 1912, we have Taft, the Republican, versus Teddy Roosevelt, the bull moose candidate, versus Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. And what happens is that the Republican vote essentially gets split, and that means that Wilson will win the presidency in 1912. He'll go into the presidency in 1912, and then, several years into his presidency, World War I will begin. So Woodrow Wilson is elected. He is the Democrat, and he will be the last of the progressive presidents that we were talking about, starting with Roosevelt, then Taft, then Wilson. His approach is called New Freedom. He wants to break up trust. He wants to protect small businesses and free enterprise, to really protect what he sees as the backbone of the American economy, mostly small businesses. An important piece of legislation in 1914 during his administration is the Clayton Antitrust Act. This will strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed way back in 1890. Something important it does is that it says that labor unions can't be prosecuted as trusts. Remember that in that era when labor unions were not supported by the government, when they generally supported employers over the unions, the Sherman Antitrust Act was often used against the labor unions to say they were an illegal business combination in some way. So this act changes that. It strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act. It makes it more easily enforced against trusts and monopolies. It will be even used later in the 20th century against AT&T and Microsoft and other big companies that you may have heard of that were considered trusts or possible monopolies. We also have the Federal Reserve Act. That's in 1913. That's going to create a kind of nationwide banking system with 12 district Federal Reserve banks in different cities. It's going to establish a new currency. It's going to control the interest rate, and it's going to appoint a Federal Reserve Board that's going to be able to control these, which is still in effect today. Then we have the Federal Trade Commission Act in 1914, and this is going to just further strengthen the kind of legislation and enforcement of unfair business practices, of monopolies, and things like that. Now, really important are two more amendments. The 18th Amendment in 1919, known as the Prohibition Amendment. This is a result of the temperance movement. It bans the production, sale, and importation of alcohol. That will later be repealed by the 21st Amendment. Then the 19th Amendment, 1920, women's suffrage, and this is kind of the crowning achievement of the women's movement. And, notice, ladies, that we have not had suffrage in this country for even 100 years yet at the time I'm speaking right now. So it's definitely something that we shouldn't take for granted, and we should really respect the struggle that the woman went through to achieve this goal. All right, that's it for today, ladies. Have a good night.